Sarah held her last $5 meant for her daughter's dinner, staring at the skeletal Colt chained to a rusted post and left to die in the mud. The choice she made in that moment would either condemn them both or become the miracle neither of them dared to believe in. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the world still looked gray and broken, much like Sarah Mitchell's life had become over the past year. She walked along the muddy dirt road on the outskirts of town, her worn boots sinking slightly into the soft earth with each step. The brown cardigan she wore had been her mother's, passed down along with so many other things that carried memories of better times. Her blue dress, faded from too many washes in cold water, clung to her thin frame as the November wind cut through the fabric. She pulled the cardigan tighter around herself, not just against the cold, but as if it could somehow hold together the pieces of her life that kept threatening to fall apart. Sarah was 28 years old. Though the lines around her eyes and the weariness in her shoulders made her look older, she was a mother to 6-year-old Emma, a bright-eyed little girl who still believed in fairy tales and happy endings, and that belief was both Sarah's greatest comfort and her deepest pain. How do you tell your child that sometimes the world doesn't care about dreams? How do you explain that being good and working hard doesn't always mean things will get better? Sarah carried 5 crumpled dollar bills in her pocket, all that remained after paying the rent on their tiny apartment above the hardware store in town. $5 to last until Friday, when she'd get paid for cleaning houses and watching Mrs. Henderson's grandchildren. The walk into town would take another 20 minutes, but Sarah had left early because she couldn't afford the bus fare. She needed to buy milk and bread, maybe some eggs if they weren't too expensive. Emma had been so good lately, never complaining about the meals that were more water than soup, never asking for the toys she saw other children playing with at school. That morning, Emma had hugged her and said she loved their little adventures together, even though Sarah knew the child was hungry and tired of hand-me-down clothes that didn't quite fit. As Sarah walked, her mind drifted to the stack of bills on the kitchen table, each one a reminder of how far behind she'd fallen. The electricity company had sent a final notice. The clinic wanted payment for Emma's last checkup. And there was still the matter of the broken window in their apartment that the landlord insisted she pay to fix, even though it had cracked during a storm. Sarah had learned to carry these burdens quietly, to smile when people asked how she was doing, to pretend that everything was manageable when it felt like she was drowning in impossibilities. The road curved ahead, and that's when she first heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the quiet morning, a desperate, painful cry that cut through the air like a knife. Sarah stopped walking, her heart suddenly pounding. She knew that sound. It was the sound of suffering, of a creature in pain calling out for help that wasn't coming. She'd heard it before, years ago when she was young and her father still had the small farm where she'd grown up. Before he'd gotten sick, before everything had fallen apart. Sarah moved toward the sound, leaving the main road and pushing through the wet grass that soaked the hem of her dress. Her boots squelched in the mud as she climbed over a broken fence and entered what had once been pasture land. Now it was just an abandoned field, forgotten and overgrown, marked by rusted equipment and collapsed fencing that spoke of dreams that had died here long ago. And there, in the middle of that desolate field, she saw him. A young colt, maybe 8 or 9 months old, with a coat the color of rust and autumn leaves. He was chained to an old metal post that had once held a gate, the chain wrapped so tightly around the post that the horse could barely move more than a few feet in any direction. The ground around him was churned into thick mud from his desperate attempts to free himself. His body was painfully thin, ribs visible beneath his matted coat, and his legs were covered in cuts and scrapes from fighting against his chains. But it was his eyes that broke Sarah's heart completely. They were wild with fear and pain, but underneath all that, there was something else, a spark of defiance, a refusal to give up, even when everything said he should. Sarah approached slowly, her hands raised to show she meant no harm. The colt's ears pinned back against his head, and he pulled against the chain, the metal links rattling as he tried to back away from her. His nostrils flared, and Sarah could see the whites of his eyes as panic gripped him. This wasn't just a horse that had been abandoned. This was an animal that had been broken by cruelty, left to die in the most heartless way imaginable. She stopped about 10 feet away, not wanting to cause him more distress. The November wind picked up, and she watched as the colt shivered, his wet coat offering no protection against the cold. How long had he been here? Days? Weeks? The mud suggested he'd been trapped for at least several days, fighting against his chains until exhaustion had finally won. Around his neck, where the chain had rubbed, she could see raw patches of skin, some bleeding, some scabbed over from previous injuries. Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes, but she blinked them back. Crying wouldn't help this creature, crying wouldn't change anything. But even as she thought this, she felt the familiar weight of helplessness settling over her shoulders. What could she do? She had $5 to her name, a daughter waiting at home, and no resources to help an animal this desperate. The sensible thing would be to walk away, to report this to someone with more power, more money, more ability to actually make a difference. But Sarah had never been particularly sensible, not when it came to creatures in need. And standing there in that muddy field, looking at this broken, frightened colt who refused to give up even when the world had given up on him, she saw something she recognized. She saw herself. Sarah crouched down slowly, making herself smaller, less threatening. She'd learned this from her father years ago, how to approach a frightened animal, how to speak in soft tones that carried comfort rather than fear. The colt watched her with those wild, desperate eyes, his body trembling not just from cold, but from the terror of not knowing what would happen next. Sarah understood that feeling intimately. She'd felt it every time she opened the mailbox to find another bill, every time Emma asked if they could afford something simple, every time she counted the coins in her purse and realized they wouldn't be enough. "Hey there, beautiful boy," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not going to hurt you. I promise. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." The words felt hollow even as she spoke them, because what could she really promise? She couldn't even keep her own daughter fed properly, couldn't promise Emma that they'd always have a warm place to sleep, or that the lights would stay on. But somehow, looking at this suffering creature, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a determination that surprised her with its intensity. She stayed crouched there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, just talking softly to the colt, letting him get used to her presence. Gradually, imperceptibly, she saw some of the tension ease from his body. His ears, which had been pinned flat against his head, slowly rotated forward, listening to the sound of her voice. His breathing, which had been rapid and panicked, began to slow. Sarah took this as permission to move a little closer, still speaking in that same gentle tone. "You've been fighting so hard, haven't you?" she continued, her voice thick with emotion. "You've been so brave all alone out here. But you don't have to fight anymore. Not right now. Just for this moment, you can rest." The colt's eyes followed her every movement, but he didn't pull against the chain again. Sarah could see the exhaustion in every line of his body, the way his legs trembled with the effort of just standing. How much strength had he burned through in his desperate attempts to free himself? When Sarah was close enough to touch him, she stopped and waited, letting him make the decision about what happened next. She extended her hand slowly, palm down, not reaching for him but offering. The colt stretched his neck forward, his nostrils flaring as he took in her scent. Then, in a gesture that made Sarah's throat tighten with emotion, he pressed his soft muzzle against her palm. It was the briefest of touches, gone almost as soon as it happened, but it felt like trust. It felt like hope. Sarah examined the chain that held him prisoner. It was old and rusted, wrapped multiple times around the metal post, before connecting to a worn leather halter that bit into the colt's face. Someone had done this deliberately, had taken this young horse and condemned him to a slow, agonizing death. The cruelty of it made Sarah's hands shake with anger. Who could do this? Who could look at a living creature and decide its life was worth nothing? She tried to unwrap the chain, but it had been secured with a padlock that hung rusted but still locked at the base of the post. Sarah tugged at it, hoping the rust had weakened it enough to break, but it held firm. She looked around the abandoned field, searching for something she could use as a tool, but there was nothing except broken wood and twisted metal that wouldn't help. Her mind raced through possibilities, each one running into the same wall of impossibility. She had no tools, no bolt cutters, no way to free him right now. But she couldn't just leave him here. The temperature was dropping, and the forecast had mentioned possible snow overnight. In his weakened state, exposed to the elements with no shelter and no food, the colt wouldn't survive another night. Sarah made a decision that probably wasn't smart, that definitely wasn't practical, but that felt absolutely necessary. She would go get help. She would find a way to free him, even if it meant using some of her precious $5 to make a phone call or catch a bus to find someone with tools. "I'll be back," she promised the colt, standing up slowly. "I know you don't understand, and I know you're scared, but I promise I'm coming back for you. Don't give up on me, okay? Just hold on a little longer." The colt watched her with those intelligent, frightened eyes, and Sarah felt her heart break all over again at the thought of leaving him, even temporarily. But staying here wouldn't save him. She needed help, and she needed it fast. Sarah ran back through the field, her boots slipping in the mud, her breath coming in gasps that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the panic clawing at her chest. What if she couldn't find help in time? What if she came back and he was gone, defeated by cold and hunger and despair? What if her promise turned out to be just another empty word in a world full of broken promises? When she reached the main road, Sarah stood there for a moment, trying to catch her breath and organize her thoughts. She was 2 miles from town, and the nearest house was old Mr. Patterson's place, about a quarter-mile back the way she'd come. Harold Patterson was in his 70s, a retired farmer who'd known Sarah's father. He had tools, including bolt cutters she'd seen in his barn when she'd helped him clean it out last spring in exchange for some vegetables from his garden. Sarah turned and started running toward Mr. Patterson's house, her cardigan flying open behind her, her dress heavy with mud and moisture. Her lungs burned and her legs ached, but she pushed herself harder. Every second counted now. Every moment she delayed was another moment that Colt spent in agony, another chance for him to give up, to let the chains and the cold and the cruelty win. Mr. Patterson was in his front yard, splitting wood for his stove, when Sarah came running up his driveway. The old man looked up in alarm as she approached, nearly stumbling over her own feet in her haste. He set down the axe immediately, his weathered face creasing with concern as he took in her mud-splattered appearance and the wild desperation in her eyes. "Sarah, what in heaven's name happened to you? Are you hurt? Is Emma okay?" His voice carried the kind of genuine worry that came from knowing someone's story, from understanding how close they were to the edge. Harold Patterson had lived in this area all his life, had watched Sarah grow from a bright-eyed girl helping her father with the farm animals to a struggling widow trying to keep her head above water after her husband died in that factory accident 3 years ago. "Emma's fine," Sarah gasped out, her hands on her knees as she tried to catch her breath. "Mr. Patterson, I need your help. There's a colt, a young horse, chained up in the old Hendricks field. He's dying, and I can't get the chain off. The lock is rusted shut, and I need bolt cutters. Please, I know I'm asking a lot, but he won't make it through another night if we don't help him now." Harold's expression shifted from concern to something harder, sadder. He'd seen plenty of animal cruelty in his 73 years, had witnessed the worst of what people could do when they decided a creature's life didn't matter. But he'd also learned to be practical, to weigh the cost of kindness against the reality of limited resources. He looked at Sarah, really looked at her, seeing the desperation that went beyond just concern for an animal. "Sarah, honey, I know you've got a good heart. Your daddy raised you right in that regard. But you need to think about this carefully. That horse needs more than just being freed from a chain. He'll need food, medical care, a place to stay. The vet bills alone could run you hundreds of dollars, and that's if he even survives. You've got Emma to think about. You can barely afford to feed yourselves as it is." Harold's voice was gentle but firm, the voice of someone trying to save Sarah from herself, from another burden she couldn't afford to carry. Sarah straightened up, and Harold saw something in her face that reminded him powerfully of her father, that same stubborn determination, that refusal to look away from suffering, even when it would be easier, smarter, more practical to do so. She met his eyes directly, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but absolutely certain. "I know all that, Mr. Patterson. I know it doesn't make sense. I know I can't afford it. I know I should walk away and let someone else deal with it, someone with money and resources and a barn full of hay, but I can't." I looked into that Colt's eyes, and I saw something that I recognize. I saw the will to survive even when everything says you shouldn't. I saw hope holding on by a thread, and if I walk away from that, if I decide that his life doesn't matter because saving it would be inconvenient or expensive or difficult, then what does that make me? What am I teaching Emma about the value of a life, about standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves? The old man was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face. Then he sighed, a deep sound that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and weary. He walked toward his barn without a word, and Sarah followed, not sure if he was helping or just going about his business. But when he emerged from the barn, he was carrying bolt cutters, a worn blanket, and a bucket. "I'll drive you back there," he said simply, "and we'll see what we're dealing with. But Sarah, I want you to promise me something. If that Colt is too far gone, if he's suffering with no real chance of recovery, you'll let me call someone to end it humanely. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is prevent more suffering, not prolong it." Sarah nodded, though the thought made her stomach turn. She understood what he was saying, understood that there were fates worse than death, that sometimes love meant letting go. But she hoped with everything in her that it wouldn't come to that. They climbed into Harold's old pickup truck, the one he'd been driving for 20 years, and headed back down the road toward the Hendricks field. The drive was silent, except for the rumble of the engine and the rattle of the bolt cutters in the truck bed. Sarah kept her hands clenched in her lap, her mind racing with everything that could go wrong. What if the Colt had already given up? What if freeing him only meant he'd run off and die somewhere else, alone and frightened? What if Mr. Patterson was right, and this was all just a waste of effort, a foolish gesture that would cost her dearly? When they pulled off the main road and bumped across the field, Sarah's heart was in her throat. She scanned the muddy expanse, looking for that rust-colored coat, those desperate eyes, and there he was, still standing, still fighting. The Colt's head came up as the truck approached, and Sarah saw fear flash through his expression. But she also saw something else. Recognition, perhaps, or at least the memory of her gentle voice and soft touch. Harold parked the truck at a safe distance, not wanting to spook the already terrified animal. He grabbed the bolt cutters and the blanket, and together, he and Sarah approached the Colt slowly. The young horse watched them come, his body tense, ready to bolt the moment he was free. Harold examined the chain and the lock, his experienced eyes assessing the situation. "This is going to be tricky," he said quietly. "That lock's rusted pretty solid, but the chain itself has some weak points. If we can cut through one of these links, we can get him loose. But Sarah, once we do this, he's going to run. He's going to be terrified and in pain, and he won't understand that we're trying to help." We might lose him completely." Sarah nodded, understanding the risk, but knowing they had to try anyway. She moved to the colt's head, speaking softly to him, trying to keep him calm while Harold positioned the bolt cutters on the chain. The sound of the bolt cutters biting through the rusted chain rang out sharp and metallic in the quiet field. The colt flinched at the noise, his muscles bunching under his matted coat as he prepared to flee. Sarah kept her hand on his neck, feeling the rapid hammer of his heartbeat under her palm, murmuring words that were more feeling than meaning. "Easy, sweetheart. We're almost there. Just a little longer. You're going to be free." Harold worked the bolt cutters with the methodical patience of a man who'd spent decades dealing with stubborn metal and recalcitrant machinery. The chain was thicker than it had looked from a distance, and the rust had actually made it harder in some places, fusing the links together in ways that resisted the cutters. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the November chill as he repositioned the tool, searching for the weakest point. "Come on, you stubborn piece of junk," he muttered under his breath. Then, with a sharp crack that seemed impossibly loud, the chain gave way. The colt felt the sudden change immediately. The weight that had held him prisoner for days was suddenly gone, and his reaction was pure instinct. He reared back, his front hooves pawing the air, and Sarah had to jump aside to avoid being struck. The halter, still attached to his head but no longer connected to the post, swung wildly as the young horse spun in a tight circle, his eyes showing white all around. "Whoa, whoa, easy there," Harold called out, stepping back to give the animal space. But the colt wasn't listening. He was beyond hearing, beyond reason, lost in a panic that came from days of terror and pain. He bolted, charging across the muddy field with a lurching, uneven gait that spoke of weakness and injury. Sarah's heart sank as she watched him run, his thin body barely able to sustain the effort, his legs trembling with each stride. "He's going to hurt himself," she said, starting to run after him, but Harold caught her arm, holding her back with surprising strength for a man his age. "Let him go for now," the old man said firmly. "He needs to feel that freedom, needs to know he's not trapped anymore. We'll follow slowly. Give him space to calm down. If we chase him now, we'll only make it worse." Sarah knew he was right, but every instinct screamed at her to go after the colt, to somehow make him understand that they were trying to help, not harm. They watched as the young horse ran in wide, panicked circles around the field, his movements growing slower and more labored with each pass. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 minutes, the colt stumbled to a halt near the far fence line, his sides heaving, his head hanging low. He was done. Whatever reserves of energy had fueled his escape were completely spent. Sarah and Harold approached slowly, carrying the blanket and bucket. The colt's ears flicked back and forth, tracking their movement, but he didn't try to run again. He simply didn't have the strength. As they got closer, Sarah could see the full extent of his injuries more clearly in the gray morning light. The raw patches around his neck where the chain had rubbed were infected, oozing clear fluid mixed with blood. His hooves were cracked and overgrown, and there were cuts along his legs from his struggles against the chain. But worse than any of the physical wounds was the look in his eyes, a profound exhaustion that went soul deep. Harold set down the bucket, which he'd filled with water from a puddle, and the colt immediately thrust his muzzle into it, drinking with desperate gulps. Sarah draped the blanket over his back, and the young horse shuddered at the contact but didn't pull away. The weight of the blanket, old and worn but still warm, seemed to anchor him somehow, a tangible reminder that he was no longer alone in his suffering. "We need to get him medical attention," Sarah said quietly, running her hand along the colt's neck with gentle strokes. "These wounds are infected, and who knows what internal damage there might be from dehydration and starvation." Harold nodded, but his expression was troubled. "The vet's going to charge a fortune just to come out here, let alone treat him, and that's assuming the horse can even be saved. Sarah, I hate to keep bringing this up, But you need to think about the practical side of this. Where's the money going to come from? Where are you going to keep him while he recovers? What are you going to feed him? Sarah looked down at the $5 bills in her pocket, the money that was supposed to buy milk and bread for Emma. She thought about the electricity bill sitting on her kitchen table, the rent that was due in 2 weeks, the long list of things she couldn't afford even before adding a horse to the equation. Every logical part of her brain told her that Harold was right, that this was impossible, that she should walk away now before she got in any deeper. But then the Colt turned his head and looked at her with those dark, pain-filled eyes, and something inside Sarah's chest cracked open. This wasn't about logic or practicality or money. This was about two broken souls recognizing each other in the wasteland of their respective struggles. This was about refusing to give up, even when giving up would be so much easier. "I'll figure it out," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "I don't know how yet, but I'll find a way. Can you help me get him to your place? Just for tonight, until I can make arrangements?" Harold looked at her for a long moment, and Sarah could see him wrestling with his own practicality, his own knowledge of how the world worked and how rarely it worked in favor of people like them. Finally, he sighed and nodded. "I've got an old stall in the barn that'll keep him out of the weather, and I suppose I can spare some hay for a few days. But Sarah, you need to have a plan. Hope and good intentions aren't going to keep this animal alive." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to say that sometimes hope was all you had and you had to make it enough. But she just nodded and helped Harold fashion a makeshift lead rope from some cord in his truck. The walk back to Harold's farm was slow and difficult. The Colt could barely put one foot in front of the other, and several times they had to stop and let him rest. Each time he stopped, Sarah worried that he wouldn't start again, that this would be where his strength finally gave out completely. But each time, after a few minutes of ragged breathing, the young horse would lift his head and take another trembling step forward. By the time they reached Harold's barn, the afternoon sun was trying to break through the gray clouds, casting weak golden light across the weathered wood and rusted metal of the old farm. The Colt was trembling with exhaustion, his legs barely supporting his weight, and Sarah felt tears threatening as she watched him struggle with each step. Harold led them to a small stall at the back of the barn, one that had been empty for years since he'd sold off his last dairy cow. The space was dusty and filled with cobwebs, but it was dry and out of the wind, and there was fresh hay stacked nearby. They managed to get the Colt inside, and the moment he felt the soft bedding beneath his hooves, his legs buckled and he sank down with a groan that sounded almost human in its relief. Sarah knelt beside him, her hand on his neck, feeling the rapid flutter of his pulse beneath her fingers. He was alive, but just barely. The fight to free himself, the terror of the bolt cutters, and the walk to the barn had depleted what little energy he'd had left. Harold brought fresh water in a clean bucket and a small amount of hay, setting them within reach of the Colt's head. "Don't let him drink too fast," he cautioned Sarah. "His system's been through hell. Too much too fast could cause colic or worse." Sarah nodded, controlling the bucket so the Colt could only take small sips at a time, even though she could see how desperately he wanted to gulp it down. "I need to make some calls," Sarah said quietly, pulling out her old cell phone. The screen was cracked, and the battery was always dying, but it still worked for now. First, she called Mrs. Henderson, explaining that she'd be late picking Emma up from school, that there had been an emergency. Mrs. Henderson, bless her, didn't ask too many questions, just said Emma could stay as long as needed. Then Sarah scrolled through her contacts, looking for Dr. Martinez's number. Dr. Elena Martinez was the only large animal veterinarian within 30 miles, and Sarah had met her years ago when her father's farm still operated. Elena had been kind then, patient with a young girl's endless questions about animal care. But kindness didn't pay for veterinary services, and Sarah knew that a house call for an emergency like this would cost money she simply didn't have. Her finger hovered over the call button for a long moment before she finally pressed it. The phone rang 3 times before a warm, professional voice answered. "Martinez Veterinary Services, this is Elena." Sarah took a deep breath and launched into her explanation, the words tumbling out in a rush. She described finding the Colt, his condition, the infected wounds, and obvious malnutrition. She told Elena where they were and that this was an emergency, that without help, the horse would die. What she didn't say, at least not right away, was that she had no money to pay for treatment. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Sarah could hear the sound of pages turning, Elena checking her schedule. "I can be there in about an hour," the vet said finally. "I'm just finishing up with a difficult foaling, but this sounds critical. Give me the address again." Sarah rattled off Harold's address, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and dread. An hour. They had an hour before she'd have to face the reality of costs and payments and all the practical details she'd been avoiding. After she hung up, Sarah sat down in the hay beside the Colt, who had his eyes closed but was still breathing in shallow, rapid gasps. Harold had gone into the house, giving them privacy, and in the quiet of the barn, Sarah finally allowed herself to process what she'd done. She'd committed to saving an animal she couldn't afford to save, had made promises she had no idea how to keep, had potentially put her daughter's welfare at risk for a creature she'd known for less than 4 hours. But as she sat there, her hand resting on the Colt's side, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. For so long, her life had been about survival, about making it through one more day, one more week, one more crisis, about being small and quiet and trying not to ask for too much from a world that had already taken so much from her. But this, sitting here in this barn with this broken animal, felt like the first choice she'd made in years that was about something larger than just getting by. The Colt's eyes fluttered open, and he looked at her with an expression that seemed almost peaceful despite his obvious pain. Sarah smiled at him through her tears. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" she whispered. "Both of us just trying to survive in a world that doesn't make it easy. Both of us a little too stubborn to know when to quit." She paused, thinking about the name she should give him. He needed a name, something that would define him as more than just a rescue case or a burden or a problem to be solved. Hope seemed too obvious, too sentimental. Survivor felt presumptuous when his survival was still very much in question. Then she thought about those $5 bills in her pocket, the last of her money that she'd been willing to spend on his freedom without hesitation. $5 that should have gone to milk and bread and practical necessities, but instead had gone toward bolt cutters and the beginning of something she didn't fully understand yet. "Chance," she said softly. "I'll call you Chance, because that's what we're both taking here, isn't it? A chance on something better. A chance that kindness matters. A chance that we're both stronger than we think." The Colt's ear flicked toward her voice, and Sarah chose to believe he understood, that somewhere in his pain-fogged mind he recognized the significance of having a name, of being seen as an individual rather than just another abandoned animal. Harold returned with a sandwich and a cup of coffee for Sarah, setting them down beside her without comment. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until she smelled the food, and she ate quickly, knowing she needed to keep her strength up for whatever came next. The older man settled onto an overturned bucket, his weathered face thoughtful as he watched the Colt. "You know, your daddy would have done the same thing," Harold said after a while. "He never could stand to see an animal suffer, even when it cost him. I remember one winter he spent near about every penny he had, nursing a sick cow back to health, even though the practical thing would have been to put her down. Your mother was fit to be tied, worried about how they'd make it through the season. But Tom, he just had this way of believing that doing the right thing would work out somehow." Sarah looked at Harold, surprised by the memory. She'd been so young when her father died, and so many of her memories of him had faded with time. "Did it?" she asked. Did it work out? Harold chuckled, a dry sound with no real humor in it. Well, they made it through that winter, if that's what you're asking. But your daddy died young and poor, and your mother worked herself into an early grave trying to keep that farm going. So I guess it depends on what you mean by working out. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Sarah didn't want to examine too closely. Before she could respond, they heard the sound of tires on gravel, and Harold stood up with a grunt. "That'll be your vet," he said, heading toward the barn entrance to greet Dr. Martinez. Elena Martinez hadn't changed much in the years since Sarah had last seen her. She was still a small woman with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, still moved with the efficient grace of someone who'd spent decades working with large animals. But there were new lines around her eyes and touches of gray in her hair that spoke of the passage of time. She carried a worn leather bag that Sarah remembered from childhood, filled with mysterious instruments and medicines that had seemed almost magical back then. "Sarah Mitchell," Elena said with a warm smile as she entered the barn, though her eyes were already scanning the stall where Chance lay. "Harold told me a bit about the situation. Let's see what we're dealing with here." She knelt beside the Colt, her hands moving over his body with practiced efficiency, checking vital signs, examining wounds, assessing the damage that days of neglect and cruelty had inflicted. Her expression grew more serious as the examination continued, and Sarah felt her stomach tighten with each shake of the vet's head. After what felt like an eternity, Elena sat back on her heels and looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed compassion with professional honesty. "Okay, here's where we are. This colt is severely malnourished and dehydrated. He's got multiple infected wounds that need immediate treatment. His hooves are in terrible condition and will need significant work from a farrier. I'm also concerned about possible internal damage from the dehydration and stress. His heart rate is elevated, his temperature is slightly high, and his gums are pale, which suggests anemia." Sarah listened to the litany of problems, each one adding weight to the impossible situation she'd created. "What does he need?" she asked quietly. Elena pulled out a notepad and began writing. "Immediately, he needs intravenous fluids to combat the dehydration, antibiotics for the infections, both topical and systemic, pain medication because he's obviously suffering. I'll need to clean and dress those wounds properly, and he'll need ongoing care for at least the next week." She paused, looking at Sarah directly. "After that, assuming he survives the immediate crisis, he'll need proper nutrition, regular hoof care, and probably several months of rehabilitation before he's healthy. This isn't a quick fix, Sarah. This is a long-term commitment." The question Sarah didn't want to ask forced its way out anyway. "How much? For the immediate treatment, I mean." Elena's expression softened even more, if that was possible, and Sarah knew the answer was going to be bad before the vet even spoke. "For today's emergency call, the IV fluids, the medications, and the initial wound treatment, we're looking at around $400. And that's me giving you the absolute bare minimum pricing, because I remember your father and I know your situation. The ongoing care, the farrier work, the feed and boarding, that's all going to add up to considerably more over time." Sarah felt the number hit her like a physical blow. $400. She had $5 in her pocket. She had bills she couldn't pay, a daughter who needed food, a landlord who was already threatening eviction. $400 might as well have been $4 million. "I don't have it," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have $400. I don't have $40. I have $5 to my name, and that was supposed to buy groceries this week." The admission hung in the air, humiliating in its honesty. Elena and Harold exchanged glances, and Sarah saw pity in their faces, which somehow made everything worse. But Elena didn't pack up her bag. Instead, she sat down in the hay next to Sarah, her voice gentle but firm. "Then why did you call me, Sarah?" Why did you commit to saving an animal you can't afford to save? It wasn't an accusation, just a question, but it cut deep anyway. Sarah looked at Chance, whose eyes were closed now, his breathing shallow but steady. "Because I couldn't walk away," Sarah said finally. I looked at him and I saw myself, broken, abandoned, fighting to survive in a world that doesn't care. And I thought, if someone doesn't stand up for him, who will? If everyone just walks by because it's too expensive or too complicated or too much trouble, then what does that say about all of us? She turned to face Elena, tears streaming down her face now. "I know it doesn't make sense. I know it's stupid and impractical, and I'm probably going to regret it. But I made him a promise and I can't break it. I won't." Elena was quiet for a long moment. Then she opened her bag and began pulling out supplies. "I'll tell you what I'm going to do," she said, her voice all business now. "I'm going to treat him today, and I'm going to give you enough medication to last the week. You're going to pay me when you can, even if that's $5 at a time over the next year. I've got a payment plan system for situations like this. It's not charity, it's a loan, and I expect to be paid back eventually. But I'm not going to let this animal die because of money." Sarah felt something break open in her chest, a flood of gratitude so intense it was almost painful. "Thank you," she managed to say through her tears. "Elena, I swear I'll pay you back every penny. I don't know how yet, but I will." The vet was already setting up an IV line, her hand steady and sure. "I know you will," she said simply. "Your father owed me money when he died, did you know that? $600 for treating your mother's horse when it got sick. He paid me back in vegetables from his garden, firewood for my stove, and labor fixing my barn roof. It took him 3 years, but he paid every cent. I figure his daughter's word is good enough for me." Harold watched this exchange with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. Then he cleared his throat. "The Colt can stay in my barn for now," he said gruffly, "and I've got hay enough to spare for a few weeks, but Sarah, you're going to need to figure out a long-term plan. I'm not running a rescue operation here." Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes. She knew Harold was right, knew that temporary solutions wouldn't be enough. But for now, watching Elena work to save Chance's life, seeing the fluids drip into his vein and the Colt's breathing ease slightly as the pain medication took effect, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt hope. The treatment took nearly 2 hours, and by the time Elena finished, dusk was settling over the farm in shades of purple and gray. Chance was resting more comfortably now, the IV fluids and pain medication working their way through his system. Elena had cleaned and dressed the worst of his wounds, coating them with antibiotic ointment and wrapping the ones on his legs with clean bandages. She'd shown Sarah how to check the IV line, how to monitor his temperature, and what signs to watch for that would indicate his condition was worsening. "You need to stay with him tonight," Elena said, as she packed up her supplies. "The first 24 hours are critical. If his condition deteriorates, if he starts showing signs of colic or shock, you call me immediately. I don't care what time it is." Sarah nodded, already mentally rearranging her life around this new responsibility. She'd have to bring Emma here, would have to explain to her 6-year-old daughter why they were spending the night in Mr. Patterson's barn instead of their own apartment. Harold, overhearing the conversation, disappeared into his house and returned a few minutes later with blankets and pillows. "You'll freeze out here once the temperature drops," he said, handing them to Sarah. "There's a space heater in the corner that still works, and I'll bring out some dinner for you and the girl. It's not much, but it's warm." The casual kindness of the gesture made Sarah's throat tight. She wasn't used to people helping without expecting something in return, wasn't used to being seen as worthy of assistance. After Elena left with promises to check in the next morning, Sarah called Mrs. Henderson to arrange picking up Emma. The walk to town and back would take over an hour, but there was no money for a taxi, and she couldn't ask Harold for any more favors than he'd already given. She set out as the last light faded from the sky, her breath forming clouds in the cold air, her mind racing with everything that had happened and everything that still needed to happen. Emma was waiting on Mrs. Henderson's porch, bundled in her thin coat and worn mittens, her backpack beside her. When she saw her mother approaching, her face lit up with that pure, uncomplicated joy that children possess. "Mama," she called out, running to meet Sarah halfway down the walk. "I made a picture at school today. Want to see?" Sarah swept her daughter into her arms, breathing in the familiar scent of children's shampoo and playground dust. "Of course I want to see," she said, forcing cheerfulness into her voice. "But sweetie, I need to tell you something. We're going to have a little adventure tonight. We're going to sleep at Mr. Patterson's farm." Emma's eyes went wide with excitement rather than concern, and Sarah felt a pang of guilt at how little it took to make her daughter happy. How a night in a barn could seem like an adventure because their normal life offered so few variations. On the walk back to the farm, Emma chattered about her day at school, about the picture she'd drawn of their family, about how her friend Michaela had shared her cookies at lunch because Emma hadn't brought any. Sarah listened with half her attention, the other half calculating how she was going to manage everything. She'd need to be at work tomorrow, cleaning houses for the few clients she had. She couldn't afford to miss a day, not with the bills already piling up. But she also couldn't leave Chance alone, not when he was so fragile. When they reached Harold's farm, Emma gasped in delight at the sight of the barn, the warm light spilling from the open door making it look cozy and inviting rather than old and weathered. And when Sarah led her to the stall where Chance lay, the little girl's face transformed into something close to wonder. "Mama," she whispered, "is that our horse?" The possessive pronoun struck Sarah's heart. Our horse. As if they were the kind of people who could have horses, who could afford such luxuries. "His name is Chance," Sarah said softly, kneeling beside Emma. "And he's very sick. We're going to take care of him and help him get better." Emma, with the fearless compassion of childhood, reached out and gently touched Chance's muzzle. The colt's eyes opened, and for a moment horse and child regarded each other with mutual curiosity. "Don't worry, Mr. Chance," Emma said in her serious little voice. "My mama is really good at taking care of things. She takes care of me all by herself, and I'm okay. So you're going to be okay too." Sarah had to turn away, blinking back tears. The simple faith in her daughter's voice, the absolute certainty that everything would work out because Mama was here, felt like both a blessing and an unbearable weight. She wanted to be the person Emma believed she was, the one who could fix everything, who could make the world safe and kind. But she was just a broke single mother who'd taken on an impossible responsibility because she couldn't stand to walk away from suffering. Harold brought them dinner as promised, simple sandwiches and soup, but to Sarah and Emma, it might as well have been a feast. They ate sitting in the clean hay near Chance's stall, Emma telling Mr. Patterson about her day with the unself-conscious ease of a child who hadn't yet learned to be ashamed of poverty or circumstances. After dinner, Sarah made a bed for Emma with the blankets Harold had provided, tucking her daughter in with promises that this was a special adventure they'd remember forever. Once Emma was asleep, Sarah settled in for her vigil beside Chance. The space heater hummed in the corner, pushing back the November cold, and the barn was quiet except for the occasional rustle of hay and the steady breathing of the colt. Sarah checked his IV line as Elena had shown her, placed her hand on his side to monitor his breathing, and felt the slight fever that still burned beneath his coat. Throughout the night she dozed in fits and starts, waking every hour to check on Chance, to adjust his blankets, to offer him small sips of water. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, when the world was at its darkest and quietest, Chance lifted his head and looked at Sarah with eyes that seemed clearer, more present than before. She moved closer, and the colt didn't shy away. Instead, he allowed her to stroke his face, to run her fingers along his neck in gentle, soothing motions. "We're going to make it through this," Sarah told him, her voice soft in the darkness. "I don't know how, and I don't know what happens after, but we're going to survive this night. And then we'll survive the next one, and the one after that. That's all we can do, really. Just keep surviving, one night at a time." Chance's eyelids drooped, and he lowered his head back to the hay, but he shifted slightly closer to where Sarah sat, as if seeking the comfort of her presence. And Sarah, exhausted and scared and uncertain about everything except her decision to be here, felt something settle in her chest. A quiet determination, a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life for so long. She'd saved Chance today, but maybe, in some way she didn't fully understand yet, he was saving her too. The first week was a blur of exhaustion and small victories. Sarah managed to juggle her cleaning jobs during the day while Harold watched over Chance, then spent her evenings and nights in the barn with Emma, monitoring the Colt's progress. Dr. Martinez came by every other day, checking the wounds, adjusting medications, and each time expressing cautious optimism about Chance's recovery. The infection was responding to the antibiotics. His fever had broken, and slowly, incrementally, he was beginning to gain strength. But the financial reality of what Sarah had undertaken became clearer with each passing day. The medication alone was costing more than she made in a week, and that didn't include the feed Chance needed, the supplies for his wounds, or the ongoing veterinary care. Sarah started taking on extra work, cleaning houses late into the evening, babysitting on weekends, anything that would bring in a few more dollars. She sold what little jewelry she had, pawned her mother's old sewing machine, and still it wasn't enough. One afternoon, as Sarah was leaving one of her cleaning jobs, her client Mrs. Woodward stopped her at the door. "I heard about what you did," the older woman said, her eyes kind behind her thick glasses. "Saving that horse, that took real courage, dear." Sarah wasn't sure how news had spread, but in a small town, stories traveled fast, especially stories about foolish young women taking on impossible tasks. She smiled politely, ready to make her exit, but Mrs. Woodward pressed something into her hand. "It's not much, but I want to help. Every little bit counts, doesn't it?" Sarah looked down at the $50 bill in her palm and felt tears spring to her eyes. She tried to refuse, tried to say it was too much, but Mrs. Woodward waved away her protests. "My late husband always said that the measure of a person isn't what they do when it's easy, but what they do when it costs them something. You keep fighting for that horse, Sarah Mitchell." Over the next few days, Sarah discovered that Mrs. Woodward wasn't the only one who wanted to help. The grocer slipped extra vegetables into her bag when she bought groceries, refusing to let her pay for them. The pharmacist where she picked up Emma's vitamins heard about Chance and donated some basic first aid supplies. Even the owner of the diner where Sarah sometimes treated Emma to breakfast gave them free meals, saying simply that good people deserved good luck. But the most surprising help came from an unexpected source. Sarah was at the barn one evening changing Chance's bandages while Emma did her homework by lamplight when a sleek black car pulled up outside. Sarah's stomach dropped, recognizing the expensive vehicle immediately. It belonged to Robert Thornton, one of the wealthiest men in the county, someone so far removed from Sarah's world that they might as well have lived on different planets. She'd cleaned his house once, had been so intimidated by the marble floors and crystal chandeliers that she'd barely been able to do her job properly. Thornton stepped out of the car, his expensive suit looking out of place against the backdrop of Harold's weathered barn. Sarah stood up slowly, wiping her hands on her jeans, wondering what could possibly have brought him here. "Mr. Thornton," she said uncertainly, "can I help you?" The man looked uncomfortable, as if he wasn't quite sure why he was here either. He cleared his throat and glanced toward the stall where Chance rested. "I heard about the Colt," he said finally, his voice gruff. "Heard you found him chained up in the old Hendricks field." Sarah nodded, confused about where this was going. Thornton shifted his weight, looking everywhere except at her. That field belongs to my cousin. Or it did, until recently. He died 6 months ago, and the property's been in probate. I didn't know there was a horse there, didn't know Marcus had gotten so cruel in his final years, but that doesn't excuse it. That doesn't excuse leaving an innocent animal to suffer. Sarah still wasn't sure what to say, so she stayed silent, waiting. Thornton finally looked at her directly, and she was surprised to see what looked like shame in his eyes. "I want to pay for the horse's care," he said abruptly. "The vet bills, the feed, whatever it costs. It's my family's fault he was in that situation, even if I didn't know about it. Let me make it right." Sarah felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Mr. Thornton, I can't accept that. It's too much." "It's not enough," Thornton interrupted. "My cousin was a bitter, angry man who took his pain out on anything weaker than himself. I should have paid more attention, should have checked on him more often, should have known something was wrong. I can't change what happened, but I can help fix the damage. Please let me do this." Sarah looked at Chance, who had lifted his head at the sound of voices, his ears pricked forward with curiosity. The Colt had come so far in just a week, had fought so hard to survive, and Sarah had fought just as hard to give him that chance, had sacrificed and struggled and barely kept her head above water. The practical thing would be to accept Thornton's offer, to let someone with resources shoulder the burden she'd been carrying alone. But something held her back. A stubborn pride, maybe, or a sense that accepting this help would somehow diminish what she'd accomplished, what she and Chance had survived together. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Thornton," she said slowly. "I really do. But Chance, he's my responsibility. I made a commitment to him, and I need to see it through." Thornton looked at her like she was speaking a foreign language. "You're turning down help. Do you have any idea how much this is going to cost long-term? Thousands of dollars, probably tens of thousands by the time he's fully recovered." "I know," Sarah said quietly. "And I don't know how I'm going to manage it all, but I'll figure it out. I have to." Emma, who had been listening to this entire exchange with wide eyes, suddenly spoke up. "My mama always figures things out," she said with absolute conviction. "She's really good at it. Even when things are hard, she never gives up." Thornton looked at the little girl, then back at Sarah, and something in his expression softened. "How about a compromise?" he said. "I'll pay the vet bills that have already accumulated. Call it restitution for my family's role in this. But going forward, the horse is your responsibility like you want." Sarah wanted to refuse even that, but she thought about the debt already mounting with Dr. Martinez, the money she was supposed to be paying back $5 at a time. She thought about Emma's worn shoes and the electricity bill and all the ways that accepting help now might make their future a little less desperate. "Okay," she said finally. "Thank you, Mr. Thornton. That's very generous." The transformation of Chance over the following months was nothing short of miraculous. What had been a broken, terrified Colt barely clinging to life gradually became a strong, spirited young horse with eyes that no longer held only fear. His coat, once matted and dull, grew in thick and glossy, the rich rust color catching the sunlight like burnished copper. The wounds healed, leaving only faint scars that Sarah thought of as badges of survival, proof that he had endured and overcome. But more remarkable than his physical recovery was the change in his spirit. Chance learned to trust again, slowly at first, then with an openness that broke Sarah's heart in the best way. He would nicker when he heard her footsteps approaching the barn, would rest his head on her shoulder when she stood beside him, would follow her around the paddock Harold had grudgingly agreed to let them use. With Emma, Chance was infinitely gentle, seeming to understand on some instinctual level that this small human needed careful handling. The little girl would sit in the hay, reading her school books aloud to him, and Chance would stand nearby, ears pricked forward, as if he understood every word. Sarah found that as she poured herself into caring for Chance, something in her own life began to shift. The act of saving him, of refusing to give up even when every practical consideration said she should, had awakened something in her that had been dormant for years. She started to believe that maybe she deserved more than just survival, that maybe fighting for something better wasn't foolish but necessary. She began taking better care of herself, not just existing but actually living. She enrolled Emma in the art classes at the community center that her daughter had been wistfully mentioning for months, found a way to scrape together the small fee. She stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. Word of Chance's recovery spread throughout the community, and people began to stop by Harold's farm just to see the horse that had beaten the odds. Children pressed their faces against the fence, watching in awe as Chance trotted around the paddock, his movements growing stronger and more confident each day. Adults shook their heads in wonder, marveling at how an animal left to die had not only survived, but thrived. And always, the story came back to Sarah, to the single mother who'd spent her last $5 and her last shred of energy to save a life that everyone else had written off as not worth saving. One Saturday afternoon in early spring, Dr. Martinez stopped by for what she said would be her final official checkup. The winter had been long and difficult, but they'd all made it through. Elena examined Chance thoroughly, checking his hooves, listening to his heart, running her experienced hands over his body. Finally, she stepped back with a smile that transformed her usually serious face. "He's healthy," she announced. "Completely healthy. I never would have believed it that first night, Sarah. But you did it. You saved him." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. But they were tears of joy this time, not despair. She wrapped her arms around Chance's neck, breathing in his horsey scent, feeling the solid warmth of him, the realness of this creature who had changed her life in ways she was still discovering. But Elena wasn't finished. "I've been thinking," she continued, her tone becoming more serious, "you've proven you can care for a horse, even under the most difficult circumstances, and Chance clearly thrives under your care. Have you thought about what comes next, where you'll keep him long term?" The question hit Sarah like cold water. She'd been so focused on getting Chance healthy that she hadn't let herself think too far into the future. Harold had been generous in letting them use his barn and paddock, but she knew he was getting older, that maintaining a farm was becoming too much for him. She couldn't expect him to house Chance indefinitely. "I've been saving money," Sarah said slowly. "Every extra dollar goes into a jar in my kitchen. I thought maybe eventually I could afford to board him somewhere, or maybe rent a small piece of land." It sounded pathetic even to her own ears, this vague plan that would take years to accomplish at the rate she was going. Elena and Harold exchanged glances, and Sarah got the sense they'd discussed something before this conversation. "What if there was another option?" Elena asked. "I've got 30 acres about 10 miles from here that I inherited from my parents. There's an old house on it, needs work, but it's structurally sound. There's a barn that could hold 4 horses, paddocks that just need fence repairs. I've been trying to figure out what to do with it for years. Can't bring myself to sell because of the memories, but I don't have time to maintain it properly." Sarah listened, not sure where this was leading, her heart starting to beat faster with something that felt dangerously like hope. "I was thinking," Elena continued, "that maybe you could live there, you and Emma. In exchange for maintaining the property, keeping it from falling apart, you'd have a place to keep Chance, a real home, not just a rented room above a store." The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Sarah couldn't process it at first. She just stared at Elena, her mouth open, words refusing to form. Harold cleared his throat. "Before you refuse because of that stubborn pride of yours," he said gruffly, "you should know that Elena needs someone she trusts to take care of that place. The last tenants, she had nearly let it fall down around their ears. You'd be doing her a favor, not the other way around." Sarah looked between them, these two people who had given her so much already, who were now offering her something she'd never dared to dream about. A home. A real home where Emma could run free and safe, where Chance could graze in his own field, where Sarah could build something stable and lasting. But the practical voice in her head, the one that had kept her alive through 3 years of struggling, spoke up. "I can't afford rent on top of everything else," she said quietly. "I'm barely making it as it is." Elena shook her head. "No rent. Just maintain the property. Fix things that break, keep the grass cut, make sure the place doesn't deteriorate. And maybe eventually, when you're on your feet, you could help me with some of the animals I treat. Be my assistant on calls, learn the business. I'm not getting any younger, and I could use someone with your dedication." It was too much. Too good. Things like this didn't happen to people like Sarah. Didn't happen in real life, where miracles were rare and help always came with strings attached. But looking at Elena's sincere face, at Harold's gruff approval, at Chance standing peacefully in the spring sunshine, Sarah felt something break open inside her. The walls she'd built around her heart, the ones that kept her safe but also kept her small, began to crumble. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, stronger. "Yes. Yes, we'll do it. Thank you. Thank you so much." Moving day came on a bright Saturday in April, when the world seemed full of possibilities. Sarah didn't have much to move, just a few boxes of clothes and books, some kitchen supplies, and the memories of a life that had been defined by struggle. Emma bounced with excitement, chattering non-stop about having her own room, about the big yard where she could play, about Chance living right outside their window. Harold came with his truck to help transport their belongings, and even Robert Thornton appeared, having somehow heard about the move and wanting to contribute a housewarming gift that turned out to be furniture for Emma's room. The house Elena had offered them was everything she'd promised and more. It was a simple farmhouse with white clapboard siding that needed fresh paint. But the bones were solid and the rooms were filled with sunlight. There were 3 bedrooms upstairs, a kitchen with windows overlooking the barn, and a front porch perfect for watching sunsets. Emma immediately claimed the smallest bedroom, the one with a window seat where she could curl up with books, and Sarah took the room next to hers, already imagining how she'd fix it up over time. But it was the barn that made Sarah's breath catch. It was old but well built, with 4 spacious stalls and a tack room that still smelled of leather and hay. When they led Chance from the trailer and into his new home, the Colt, now nearly a yearling, walked in with his head high and his ears pricked forward. He explored every corner of his stall, then walked out into the paddock and, in a moment that made everyone watching laugh with pure joy, took off running. He galloped in wide circles, his tail streaming behind him like a banner, his powerful legs eating up the ground, celebrating his freedom and his strength and his second chance at life. Sarah stood at the fence watching him, Emma tucked under her arm, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the absence of problems or challenges, because there would always be those, but a deep, settled peace that came from knowing she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Chance slowed to a trot, then walked over to where they stood, pushing his nose over the fence to nuzzle first Emma, then Sarah. The little girl giggled and wrapped her arms around his face, and the horse stood perfectly still, patient and gentle with the child who had read him stories in a cold barn through the darkest part of winter. In the months that followed, Sarah's life transformed in ways both large and small. She learned veterinary assistance under Elena's patient teaching, discovering she had a natural aptitude for working with animals. She started earning a steady income, not much at first, but reliable in a way her cleaning jobs had never been. She was able to buy Emma new shoes when the old ones wore out, to keep the electricity on without panic, to build a small emergency fund that grew dollar by dollar. The weight of constant crisis that had pressed on her shoulders for so long gradually lifted, replaced by the normal concerns of daily life. But more than the practical improvements, Sarah found herself becoming someone she barely recognized. Someone who laughed more easily, who dreamed about the future instead of just trying to survive the present. She fixed up the farmhouse room by room, learning skills from YouTube videos and Harold's patient instruction. She planted a garden, vegetables mostly, but also flowers because Emma said every home needed beauty. She joined the other mothers at Emma's school events instead of lurking on the edges, feeling like she belonged for the first time in years. Chance grew into a magnificent horse, strong and healthy and full of spirit. People from town would stop by sometimes just to see the famous rescue horse, to hear the story of how a single mother with $5 had saved a life, and in doing so, had somehow saved her own. Sarah never tired of telling Chance's story because it wasn't really about the horse. It was about refusing to walk away from suffering, about believing that every life has value, about the way one act of compassion can ripple outward in ways you never expect. On the anniversary of the day she found Chance, Sarah stood in the paddock with her daughter and her horse watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Emma was 8 now, confident and happy, doing well in school and dreaming about becoming a veterinarian like Dr. Martinez. Chance was in his prime, glossy and powerful, with no trace of the broken colt he'd once been, except for those faint scars that Sarah still thought of as badges of honor. "You know what I think about sometimes," Sarah said to Emma, running her hand along Chance's neck. "I think about that morning when I found him. I almost walked away. I almost decided it was too much, too hard, that I couldn't handle one more problem." Emma looked up at her mother with those wise eyes that seemed too old for her young face. "But you didn't walk away," she said simply. "You never walk away, Mama. That's who you are." Sarah pulled her daughter close, overwhelmed by love and gratitude for this life they'd built together. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, hopeless and exhausted, counting her last few dollars and wondering how she'd make it through another week. She thought about how close she'd come to letting fear and practicality steal her chance at something better. "No," Sarah agreed, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't walk away. And because of that, because she'd found the courage to spend her last $5 on bolt cutters and hope, because she'd refused to let cruelty win, everything had changed. Chance had gotten his second chance at life, and somehow, miraculously, so had she. They'd saved each other. This broken woman and this broken horse had proven that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is believe that tomorrow might be better than today, that kindness matters, that love is worth the risk. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah Mitchell stood surrounded by everything she'd fought for and everything she'd found along the way. A home, a purpose, a future bright with possibility, and a horse named Chance who'd taught her the most important lesson of all, that sometimes the life you save is your own.